Mr. Bruff is the English teacher, but sometimes he teaches other things too.
Hello everybody and welcome to this video. This is the third video in my series on religious education, so please do check out the other two. They're all in the playlist, which this one is in as well. But in today's video, which will be quite short I expect, we are going to look at this question: why should we trust the Bible? So in the last two videos we kind of came to the conclusion, I think, that the world, the universe and all life has been created. Scientific evidence would point out that they were created. Now, a Christian viewpoint would be that they were created by the God of the Bible. And today's starting point really is, well, okay, if I accept that the universe and the world and humans and animals were created by something or someone, why should I trust the account of the Bible that it is God who created all of those things? So we're going to look at the Bible and why we can trust it. I'm going to start with this question: how do we know of anything or anyone from history? So today's a bit different with our kind of recording information and the internet and, you know, everything being kept on video and that sort of thing. But if we're talking about history from hundreds and thousands of years ago, how do we know of things that took place? How do we know of Emperor Nero? How do we know of these historical events and people and places? Well, the truth is, the answer is that we know of these things, these people and places and events, because of historians. So historians throughout time have written down accounts, historical documents about the time that they were living. This is one such historian. This is Tacitus, a very famous historian, a Roman senator, and he has written a lot of historical documents that we now use to base our ideas on of what was going on at the time. So, for example, if you know anything of Nero, it's because of Tacitus. So Tacitus is an example of a historian that we study, and we base our knowledge of history on historical writings by such historians. So we also use the criterion of multiple attestation to prove a historical event took place. Now let me explain that in simple terms. I want you to imagine that someone comes into your class and tells you a weird story about a friend who got arrested for climbing on top of the school building in a Santa suit. My picture there is just a Google image search, but imagine, there's no picture, they just tell you this story. Well, of course, at first, when you hear a really odd story like that, you would think your friend was messing around. You think they're pulling your leg, winding you up. But then imagine that you go out at lunchtime and another friend tells you the same story. And when you go home, your mum tells you she's heard the same story. And that is about this criterion of multiple attestation, which basically says that the more copies, the more accounts we have of a certain thing, the more we believe it to be true. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what about Jesus? How does he fit into all of this? And there's my deliberately quite humorous picture of Jesus. But how does Jesus fit into history? Let's have a look at it. What do we know from history about Jesus? Well, let's go back to Tacitus to start with. As I said to you, Tacitus was a Roman senator and a historian, and anything that we know about people like Nero and Caligula, the famous emperors, we know from the writings of Tacitus. He is a trusted and respected historian. But you can see where I'm going to go with this. Tacitus also wrote about Jesus. And in fact, here are some of his writings. And this is a quotation taken from one of his documents. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, or Christ, Jesus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here we see the historian Tacitus referring to Christians, who are a class of people who were absolutely hated in society, he tells us, and were tortured here for something, some event that's taken place. And then he just sort of mentions as an aside that Christians were followers of Jesus Christ, someone who was crucified, suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And that is a historical document. So Tacitus confirms that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate, and he had followers called Christians. Well, you might or might not know this, but the Bible says in Matthew 27:1, sorry, it's a bit hard to read on the screen, isn't it? When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. He delivered him to be crucified. So the Bible tells us exactly what Tacitus confirms in his historical account, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. I think that's pretty interesting, but it does take us back to the criterion of multiple attestation. Surely we can't base everything on the one writing of Tacitus. Did anybody else write about Jesus back at the time? Well, this is Josephus, a first century historian. Again, an extremely famous historian who wrote all sorts of things that we now take as absolute truth in history because we have his writings. Here's an example. He writes here about James, the brother of Jesus. So let's read this. And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. Festus was now dead, Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned to death, that is. Now, here we have a mention then of Jesus, who was called the Christ meaning the Messiah, the King, the Anointed One. And we have a mention of his brother called James. And sure enough, in the Bible it does say, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? So the Bible does back up that Jesus had a brother called James, just like the historian Josephus writes. But Josephus writes something much more fascinating in one of his other books. He writes this. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, this is not from the Bible. This is not some Christian guy. This is a historian writing about it. And it really is fascinating. And basically, there are 9 or 10 historians at the time and historical documents that talk about Jesus. And history then confirms through the writings of Tacitus, through the writings of Josephus, and all of the others, history does confirm that Jesus existed, that he was famous as a teacher, that he was known as a healer, that he was crucified, and that he had the title Christ, Anointed Messiah. And this is the big thing to get your head around in this video. These points are regarded as being beyond reasonable doubt by virtually all historians around the world. Okay, those things on the screen are beyond reasonable doubt. Now, I've spoken to a few people about this, and they raise a couple of points. They say, well, what about the gap between when Jesus was alive and when he was written about? How do we know how accurate the writings are if they were written a long time later? And they also say, what about the number of historical manuscripts we have found? How many documents have we actually found? Yes, there might have been 9 writers that mention him, but how many copies of the documents have been found? And I'll finish with this interesting thing. So let's see if I can just zoom in a bit so I can see this a bit better. Now, you'll have to excuse my my pronunciation, but Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century before Christ. The earliest copy we now have is around AD 900, so there's a 1300-year gap. And for each of these works we have 8 copies, and yet no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. So I can say Herodotus because that's the word I can pronounce. But everything we know about Herodotus, well, the most recent documents that, the closest in relation to when he was alive were written 1300 years later. And we only have 8 copies of any documents about Herodotus. But we believe that he was a real guy, he's a historical figure, and no one would doubt that. What about Tacitus? There's a 1000-year gap between the original and the first copy, a total of 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, there's a 950-year gap between the original and the first found copy, and we have 9 or 10 copies in, that we actually have today. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap between the original and the first copy, a total of 20 copies. So it is kind of historical practice, normal practice, that there is a big gap between when things took place and when we have the first documents about them, and that we don't have many documents about them. And that comes as a surprise to us today, of course, because we have, the internet and much more sophisticated printing equipment, computer records and all the rest of it. But really, all of our history, Roman history and kind of the really old history, is based on these sort of numbers. So what about the New Testament? What about the Bible? Well, here we go. The New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. So the New Testament was written between 40 years after Jesus' death and 100 years after his death. The earliest copy we have is AD 130. So we actually have documents that are just 130 years after Jesus' death. That's the earliest ones we found. We have full manuscripts AD 350. So at most there's a 300-year gap. And we don't just have 8 or 20 manuscripts. How many manuscripts do we have about Jesus? And the point here is, if Jesus was really who he said he was, if he was really the Son of God, surely it would have had a big impact. Okay, so let's have a look. We have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 other manuscripts that all tell of the New Testament. So the sort of summary point here is that history proves Jesus was a real man, and not just that he was some guy, but that all of those things I went through earlier, that he was a teacher, a reputed healer, that he was crucified, that he was the leader of Christianity, all of those things are without doubt, they're proven, not by Christians, not by the Bible, not by, people who have just got a sort of an agenda and they want to kind of prove that he's real, but just by the same historians and the same sort of processes that we use for all of our world history. But the question is, well, if he was a real man, who was he? Okay, so if Jesus is real, who was he? Was he the Son of God, or was he just an ordinary bloke, or was he something else completely? And that's what we're going to look at next week. So please do subscribe to the channel and come back next week to see the different ideas about who Jesus was. Thank you.